In this lecture, there'll be a basic reminder of the Blender interface and we'll introduce you to keyframes. Okay, so I'm in the basic startup file. I'm in Blender 3.62 and I'm in the layout workspace. Now there is an animation workspace which I'll talk about later, but we can do a lot from the basic layout workspace as well. So as a reminder, the layout workspace, we start with 3 objects here, the light, the camera and the cube. Anything I select has an orange outline, and you can also see that in the outliner over here. It lists my different objects in the scene and the cube is highlighted an orangey yellow. Underneath this we have the properties window, and you can of course change these windows with the dialog box up here. And within the properties window we have the object data properties opened up, and you can see the transform information of our cube or our selected object just here, and that will be useful to us in just a moment. Now additionally to this, down at the bottom here we've got a timeline window. It's kind of tricky to see that this is a separate window, but I can move my mouse over the middle here and extend that out nice and easily so we can clearly see the timeline. And the timeline is important for viewing our animations. We've got some readouts here, the current frame, which is frame 1, and the start and finish of our animation. So this is 250 frames in length, but to start off with, that doesn't really mean a lot. I'm going to go across to my output settings just here, and this will give us some of the same information like the start and end of our animation in frames, but it also gives us the frame rate. So the frame rate in this case is 24 FPS or frames per second. So the ending of 250 is around 10 seconds, give or take a few frames. I'll come back to this information later on, but it's worth keeping that in the back of your mind that 24 frames is 1 second of time. Okay, so let's actually animate something. Well, we've got our cube selected, so we may as well animate that. I'm at frame 1 at the moment, and I want to set the cube's position where it is now as a start point. So I'm going to insert what's called a keyframe. I can right click on my object and go down to insert keyframe, but it's a good idea to remember the keyboard shortcut, which is I. So with my mouse over the viewport, if I press I get an insert keyframe menu, and you can see all the options here. Now it's worth saying that if my mouse is over the timeline and I press I, it gives me different options, which I'll talk about later, but for now, we'll just press I over the viewport. So I'll press I, and for my cube, which is the object selected, I'm going to keyframe the location. Now I'm going to jump back to the data properties, and you can see my location is now highlighted a yellowy color. You can also press N on your keyboard, and under the menu that comes up, go to the item tab, and you can also see your transforms just there, which are the same as these. Now when it's highlighted yellow like this, it means that the current frame, which is frame 1, we can tell by our blue playhead just here, has a keyframe, and it gives us this big diamond shaped icon at the end there as well. If I move my playhead across slightly, let's go to 50 frames. So that's roughly 2 seconds. We do this with left click and drag on the actual playhead, which is in blue. It turns green. And in fact, wherever I move this, apart from that keyframe, will be green, unless I'm on that keyframe, which will be yellow. So I'll go back to frame 50 where it's green. It's green because it means there is a keyframe on this object, which means there is some animation data recorded for this object. That's because we inserted a keyframe at frame 1. Although it isn't actually moving, if I scrub across the timeline like this, no actual transformation happens, but there is some animation data there. Okay, let's move our cube. So I'll come around to the front slightly. Remember, you've got your Cartesian coordinates here if you ever get confused. And I'm going to move it on the x-axis, which is the red line. So I'll press G to grab, X for the x-axis, and 5. So it moves along 5 Blender units. And I'll press Enter to lock that in place. Now you can see that the x-axis has an orange color now. That's telling us there's some movement, but I haven't actually recorded a keyframe yet. Now don't follow along with me, but if I move my playhead now, it jumps back to the start. So that keyframe there is kind of set for the whole of this animation. And if I want to move it, then I need to record a new keyframe. So back to frame 50, I'll press GX and then 5 once again and press enter. And this time I'll press I and insert a keyframe for the location. Now we've got another yellow diamond in our timeline. And if I drag my playhead back to the beginning and across again, you can see we've got some movement. And notice when I go over the keyframe, we've got the yellow highlight. When I'm away from the keyframe, it's green. And I get back to the other keyframe, it's yellow. Okay, so now's a good time to pause the video and catch up with me, moving your cube 5 Blender units in the x-axis over 50 frames. Pause the video and have a go at that. Now what I want to do is show you a common mistake that students often make. I'm going to delete the 2 keyframes so I can left click and drag, selecting both of these keyframes and press delete. Now the cube stays in its last location, but if I scrub across the timeline, you can see that there's no animation data anymore. I can actually type in 0 in here and it will go back to the world origin. But again, no animation data. Now if I go back to frame 1, which was our starting point, it's got its current position, which is great, but I often see students forgetting to add a keyframe at this point. You need to set the start keyframe. I often see students jump to frame 50 and do the transformation, so G, X, then 5, press enter, and then insert the keyframe for the location, so I, and then click on location, and then wonder why they haven't got any animation. Well, it's because they haven't got that original keyframe. So obviously we need to keyframe the start. Make sure you do that. Make sure you remember to add a keyframe for its starting position. It may seem obvious, but it's surprising how often I see that. So I can actually type in to the location here, 0, and press enter. And then remember to press I and insert a keyframe for the location here. And once again, we have our movement across the x-axis. So currently 50 frames is just slightly over 2 seconds, because remember 1 second is 24 frames. So a quick challenge to you, I want my cube to move the same distance, but I only want it to take 1 second instead of 2 and a bit. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so the way to do that, we know that our last keyframe is the position we want to be in, but we just want to get there a bit quicker. Well, we can select this keyframe and press G to grab and move it across to 24 frames. And you can see there's a readout just above me, which will tell me the frame I'm on in the brackets. So there's frame 24 there. And now the animation is taking 1 second. Now this is tricky to see without playing the animation. So to play the animation, we've got play buttons here, or I can just press the space bar and you can see it moving across and it takes 1 second. Okay, another challenge to you is to make the animation last for roughly 3 seconds. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so it's nice and simple. G to grab and move it out to roughly frame 75-ish. I'll bring my playhead back to beginning, press the space bar, and you can see it moving a lot more slowly. Okay, so for the last challenge, I want you to set a frame in the middle here where it moves in the y-axis 5 and then comes back down here to finish on the x-axis again. So you'll need to put a keyframe for the position in the y-axis of 5 Blender units or 5 meters. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully you understood what I meant. I'll just move my viewport around here slightly. You could of course go to top view with 7 on your numpad or press the Cartesian coordinate here. And I need to remember to put my playhead in the middle here. We might as well be precise this time, which should be 24 plus 12. So that's 1 second plus half a second, which is 36. Then I can press G, then Y, 5 and press enter. And remember to insert keyframe. So I and insert keyframe for the location. So here's our animation, goes up and comes back down to that point there. Let's just see that from a different perspective over here. Play through the animation, and that's perfect. Okay, so hopefully you got an okay with that. And we'll continue this in the next lecture, but we will be starting with a fresh new file. But do remember to save your work if you want to keep a record of these things. See you in the next lecture.